Charleston, a quiet southern town where nothing ever seemed to change, was about to uncover a story hidden in plain sight. When Victor Chavez, a seasoned night patrol officer, first saw the young black girl outside the laundromat, he thought little of it. But night after night, she was there, alone, wrapped in an oversized jacket, clutching a plastic bag of clothes like it was all she had. Something about her didn't sit right. Where did she go when the laundromat closed? Why did she always seem ready to run? Victor didn't know it yet, but this one quiet observation would change both their lives forever. Because Saoirse wasn't just another lost child, and Victor wasn't just another cop. Let's find out how. Victor Chavez didn't believe in ghosts, but some nights, Charleston sure felt like it had its fair share. It wasn't the kind of town where things happened, at least not anymore. A few decades ago, maybe, back when the mills were still running, when people actually had places to be. Now, it was just a town caught somewhere between surviving and being forgotten, where the neon signs flickered like they were too tired to stay lit. Victor knew every street, every alley, every crumbling brick building with police signs that had been gathering dust for years. Knew which porches still had rocking chairs on them, which streetlights hadn't been fixed since last winter. He knew it because for the last 5 years, these streets had been his home. At least the only home that still made sense. His real home, the one with laughter and warmth and the smell of fresh coffee in the morning, had been taken from him 7 years ago on a rainy highway. A semi-truck, a moment of distraction, a phone call that never came. Since then, night shifts had been a refuge, a way to stay moving when the past tried to catch up with him. And yet, here he was, sitting in his patrol car, parked on the far side of Main Street, watching a laundromat like it held the answers to a question he hadn't even figured out how to ask. Because she was here again. A little girl, no older than 8 or 9, standing just outside the glass doors. She was small, almost swallowed by the oversized jacket she wore, the fabric hanging loose around her shoulders. Her skin was a deep, warm brown, and her braids were neat, tucked behind her ears. In her hands, she carried a plastic bag filled with what he could only assume were clothes. Victor had seen plenty of kids in this town, but not many like her. Charleston wasn't the kind of place where a young black girl could go unnoticed, especially not at this hour, especially not alone. It wasn't just her presence that stood out. It was the way she carried herself, wary and careful, like she already knew the world wouldn't give her the same kindness it gave others. Victor had first noticed her 3 nights ago. At first, he hadn't thought much of it. Maybe her folks worked late. Maybe she was here with an older sibling, helping with laundry because no one else could. But then, the next night came, and the next. And every time, she was alone. Same time, same routine. Like clockwork. She would walk inside, head straight to the back where the older machines were, and start loading the washers. No hesitation, no wandering, no waiting for someone to meet her. Victor had seen enough in his life to know that wasn't normal. He leaned back against the seat, fingers tapping lightly against the steering wheel as he watched her push through the glass doors. Through the window, he could see the inside of the laundromat. Rows of humming machines, cracked vinyl chairs lined up against the far wall, a vending machine that probably hadn't been restocked in months. The only other person in the building was a man slumped in one of the chairs near the door, his head nodding forward, a newspaper spread across his lap. Victor shifted in his seat. Something about this didn't sit right with him. The girl moved like she had done this a dozen times before. She pulled clothes from the bag, small things, kid-sized, some faded and worn, and sorted them with practiced ease. The way she measured out the detergent, checked the settings, it all felt deliberate. Not the kind of thing a kid does when they're just tagging along with a parent. A flicker of doubt crossed Victor's mind. Maybe he was overthinking it. Maybe this was nothing. But the more he watched, the more that feeling in his gut twisted. Because if she had parents nearby, why hadn't he seen them? If she wasn't alone, why did she carry herself like she was? Victor exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. He told himself to let it go, to stop looking for problems where there weren't any. But the truth was, he had seen too many things in his life to ignore it now. And something about that little girl, standing alone in the hum of the machines, didn't feel right. Victor wasn't the kind of man who got spooked easy. He had spent too many nights patrolling these streets, seen too much, accidents, fights, folks making bad decisions in dimly lit alleys. He knew how to read a situation, how to separate what was worth worrying about from what wasn't. But this was different. The girl wasn't just a passing curiosity anymore. She was a pattern, a question that wouldn't leave him alone. So he adjusted his routine. It wasn't a big change, just enough to make sure his route took him past the laundromat a little more often. He'd slow down as he drove by, letting his eyes linger just long enough to see if she was there. And sure enough, she always was. Same time, same place. Always alone. She moved carefully, like she didn't want to be noticed. Sometimes, just before she stepped inside, she'd glance over her shoulder, scanning the street the way someone does when they're making sure they haven't been followed. It wasn't the kind of thing kids did unless they had a reason to, and that was what gnawed at Victor the most. She was just a kid. No older than his daughter would have been if... He stopped the thought before it could settle. Instead, he sat in his car, one hand wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold, watching the glow of the laundromat spill onto the empty sidewalk. That's when he heard them. Two women walking past, their voices low but sharp in the quiet. "That little girl's in there again," one of them muttered. "Same as last night." "I don't like it," the other said. "A kid that age, all alone, at this hour? Ain't right." Victor kept his eyes on the laundromat, listening. "Somebody should call CPS or something," the first woman continued. "You ask me, that girl's got nowhere to go." Their voices faded as they moved on, but their words stuck. He hadn't been the only one to notice. Victor drummed his fingers against the steering wheel, jaw tightening. If folks in town were talking, it wouldn't be long before someone actually did make that call, and maybe that was the right thing to do. Maybe he should have been the one to do it. But something held him back. He had dealt with CPS before, knew how the system worked, knew that sometimes, even with good intentions, kids slipped through the cracks. If this girl really was alone, if she had no one to turn to, calling in the authorities wouldn't necessarily mean she'd be better off. It might mean she'd just be shuffled from one place to another, lost in paperwork, forgotten in the way kids like her so often were. No, he needed to know more before he did anything. He needed to be sure. That night, Victor made a decision. He wasn't just going to watch anymore. He was going to talk to her. The next night, he waited. Parked across the street, engine off, just another car in the dark. He watched as she arrived, slipping around the corner before making her way to the laundromat door. She did the same thing as before, glancing back, making sure no one was paying attention, except this time, someone was. Victor took a breath, then got out of his car. He crossed the street slowly, careful not to startle her. As he reached the laundromat door, he paused, watching her through the glass. She was already at one of the machines, pulling clothes from her bag with small, careful hands. He pushed the door open. The chime above rang softly, but she heard it. Her hands froze mid-movement, shoulders going stiff. Victor took a few steps inside, keeping his posture relaxed, non-threatening. "Hey there," he said, his voice steady. She didn't turn around. "I've seen you here a few nights now," he continued, keeping his tone light. "You helping your folks with the laundry?" Slowly, she turned. Her eyes met his, dark and wary, filled with something he recognized all too well. Fear. Not the kind that came from being caught doing something wrong. The kind that came from expecting something bad to happen. Victor felt something in his chest tighten. He lifted his hands slightly, a silent reassurance. "I don't mean to bother you," he said. "Just wanted to make sure you're okay." For a second, he thought she might answer. Her lips parted just slightly, like she was about to say something, but then, just as quickly, she seemed to think better of it. Instead, she took a small step back, putting the washing machine between them. Victor remained still, watching the girl as she stood behind the washing machine, her small hands gripping the edges like she needed something solid to hold on to. Her reaction wasn't what he had expected. A kid her age might have been startled, embarrassed, or even annoyed that a cop was paying attention to them, but Saoirse had looked at him like she was bracing for something, like she had already decided that nothing good ever came from a stranger asking questions. He didn't push her. Years on the force had taught him that the quickest way to get someone to shut down was to corner them. He had already seen it in her. The way she instinctively put distance between them, the way her body tensed as soon as she felt someone watching. So he stepped back, hands in his pockets, and gave her space. The laundromat was quiet, just the steady hum of machines filling the air. Saoirse stood still for a long moment, her face unreadable, before turning away and going back to folding her clothes with practiced care. Victor exhaled, rubbing his hand along his jaw as he backed toward the door, his instincts telling him to let it go, but his gut telling him that this wasn't over. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped outside, but he didn't leave. He leaned against the hood of his patrol car, watching the glow of the laundromat's fluorescent lights spill out onto the empty sidewalk. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for, but something about the girl wouldn't let him walk away just yet. The moment came sooner than expected. The door to the laundromat swung open again, and a woman walked in, balancing a laundry basket against her hip. Victor straightened slightly, eyes narrowing as he watched Saoirse's reaction. The girl stiffened, not much, just a fraction of a second, but enough that Victor noticed. She didn't look surprised, didn't look relieved, just wary. She swallowed and mumbled, "Hi, Miss Linda." Not Aunt Linda. Not Mama. Just Miss Linda. The formality of it stuck in his mind like a splinter. The woman, mid-40s, tall, broad-shouldered, with tired eyes that flicked toward the girl for only a second, gave her a single nod. She didn't speak. Didn't ask why Saoirse was there alone so late. Didn't acknowledge her in any meaningful way. Just that quick, impersonal nod before she set her laundry down and got to work. Victor had seen enough in his lifetime to know what it looked like when a child belonged to someone. There was an ease to it, even when the adult was distracted or tired. Even when they didn't say much, there was a certain familiarity, a shared presence, a connection in the way they existed in the same space. This wasn't that. Victor kept his arms crossed, watching through the windshield. Saoirse didn't move closer to the woman, didn't try to talk to her. Instead, she focused on her own laundry, silent and careful, as if they were two strangers in the same room. Minutes passed. Linda went about her business with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Saoirse remained in her corner, keeping her head down, her fingers moving precisely as she folded each piece of clothing. Then, just as suddenly as she had arrived, Linda finished loading the machine, grabbed her empty basket, and walked out. She didn't say goodbye, didn't give Saoirse another look. Victor had been watching closely, and he saw it the second Linda was gone. The way the tension drained from the girl's shoulders, the way her breath came a little easier. She hadn't been relaxed before, but now she looked less on edge. That was all Victor needed to see. He had been right. This wasn't just a kid helping with laundry. This was something else entirely. Before he could fully process his next move, Saoirse grabbed her bag, shoved her neatly folded clothes inside, and started toward the door. She wasn't hesitating. She was leaving. Victor took a step forward just as she pushed outside. "Hey, kid." The second she heard his voice, she bolted. Victor's heart kicked up as he reacted purely on instinct, his feet moving before his mind fully caught up. She was fast, slipping through the dimly lit streets like she had done it 100 times before, weaving between parked cars and cutting across empty intersections with the kind of confidence that told him this wasn't the first time she had needed to disappear. "Saoirse," he called, but she didn't stop, didn't even glance back. Victor had chased plenty of people in his time, thieves, drunks, teenagers with too much energy and too little sense, but never a child, and never like this. Saoirse ran with the kind of speed that came from necessity, from experience. She wasn't just fast, she was calculated. She knew which corners to take, which shadows to slip into, which gaps in fences were just big enough for her small frame. And then she was gone. Victor stopped at the entrance to the cemetery, his pulse steady despite the chase. He scanned the darkness, listening, waiting. Nothing but the whisper of wind through the grass. No sound of footsteps, no rustling, no movement at all. It was as if she had vanished into the night. He exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. The first time she ran, he had let her go. This time, he couldn't. He needed to know who she was, where she came from, and, most importantly, who had left her out here to fend for herself. Back at the station, the room was quiet except for the occasional click of a keyboard and the hum of the overhead lights. Victor sat at his desk, staring at the screen as he scrolled through records, looking for anything that matched the little girl he had been chasing through Charleston's streets. But there was nothing. No missing child reports, no recent CPS cases matching her description, no school enrollment records. It was as if she didn't exist. Victor leaned back in his chair, frustration settling deep in his chest. This wasn't possible. A kid couldn't just fall off the map. Not in a town this small. He tapped his fingers against the desk, thinking. If she wasn't in the system, he needed to go to the people who actually saw things in this town, the ones who weren't filing paperwork but watching from their porches, their windows, their shop fronts. And that meant talking to them. The laundromat was empty when he arrived the next afternoon, the fluorescent lights flickering weakly overhead. The air smelled of detergent and something faintly metallic, like old pipes. Victor turned toward the staircase in the back, the one leading up to the second-floor apartments. He knocked on the first door, then stepped back, waiting. It took a minute, but eventually the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her 70s, wrapped in a thick cardigan despite the lingering warmth of the day. Her eyes squinted up at him, sharp despite her age. "You're Chavez, boy," she said, more statement than question. Victor gave a slow nod. "Yes, ma'am." She studied him for another second, then huffed. Didn't think I'd see you knocking on my door. What's this about? Victor shifted his weight slightly, his voice calm. The little girl that comes here at night. You ever talk to her? The woman's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. Serse? She asked, like she already knew the answer. So she had been watching. Victor nodded. Yeah, Serse. You know anything about her? The old woman crossed her arms, her grip tightening around the fabric of her cardigan. She don't talk much, she admitted. Shows up late, keeps her head down, never causes trouble, but she won't take help either. Victor frowned. You ever see an adult with her? She hesitated, just for a second. No, she said finally. Not once. That was all he needed to hear. Thank you, ma'am, he said, tipping his head slightly before stepping away. She didn't call after him, didn't ask him why he wanted to know. He had a feeling she already had her own suspicions. Victor didn't stop there. He asked around. Store owners, gas station clerks, the old men who sat outside the diner nursing coffee like it was the only thing keeping them alive. A pattern began to emerge. Serse wasn't new. She had been around for months, maybe longer, but she had never belonged anywhere. She stayed in the laundromat at night. She was seen near the back of the grocery store once or twice, eating food that hadn't been paid for. A gas station clerk remembered her filling up a water bottle from the bathroom sink before slipping away unnoticed. No home, no family, no one looking for her. Victor felt something cold settle in his stomach. He kept pushing, asking more, listening carefully. And then finally, he got what he was looking for. The woman who ran the bakery had a niece who worked at the county hospital. A few months back, a woman had come in, malnourished, weak, coughing up blood. She hadn't made it through the night. She had a daughter, a little girl. Victor's chest tightened. He didn't need to ask what happened to the girl. He already knew. Serse had been alone ever since. Victor sat in his patrol car, the weight of the revelation settling deep in his chest. Serse had been alone all this time, surviving on scraps, hiding in laundromats, slipping through the cracks like a shadow. No family, no home, no safety. Just a child, left to fend for herself in a world that hadn't spared her mother either. He let out a slow breath, fingers tightening around the steering wheel. He had seen cases like this before. Kids shuffled into the system, passed from one home to another, each move stripping away another piece of them until there was nothing left but guarded eyes and quiet resignation. That couldn't happen to her. Victor knew what he had to do. The call to Child Protective Services was short and to the point. He laid out the situation, the fact that a young girl had been living on her own, slipping through the system unnoticed. The woman on the other end listened, asked the necessary questions, then paused before saying, "We'll need to place her in temporary care until a long-term solution is found." Victor didn't hesitate. "She can stay with me." There was a beat of silence. "That's not standard procedure, Officer Chavez," the woman said, her voice careful. "Are you a licensed foster parent?" "No," he admitted. "But I've worked with kids before. I know how this process goes." Another pause. "You understand that this is a big commitment? It's not just about giving her a place to stay for a night or two." Victor glanced through the windshield, back toward the laundromat. Serse was inside, sitting on the bench, her arms wrapped around her backpack, eyes staring at nothing. "I understand," he said. When he walked into the laundromat, Serse barely looked up. She had heard the door chime, had registered his presence, but she didn't react. Just sat there, small and still, as if making herself invisible. Victor pulled up a chair a few feet away, giving her space. "Serge," he said gently. She flinched at the sound of her name but didn't move. "I talked to some people," he continued, "about finding you a place to stay." Now she did look up, eyes dark with something unreadable. "A place," she repeated, her voice flat. Victor nodded. "With me." She stared at him, her grip tightening on the straps of her bag. Why? It was a simple question, but the way she asked it, low, cautious, like she was waiting for the catch, made something ache in Victor's chest. He had an answer, but he didn't want to say too much, didn't want to push her. So he settled on honesty. "Because no one should be alone," he said. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she shifted her gaze away, staring down at her lap. Victor didn't press her. He let the silence stretch, let her sit with the idea, let her choose. Finally, she gave the smallest nod. The drive home was quiet. Serge sat in the passenger seat, small and curled into herself. Her bag still clutched tight against her chest, like it held everything she had left in the world. Victor kept his hands steady on the wheel, resisting the urge to glance over too often. He knew what this was. She wasn't just wary. She was waiting. Waiting for something to go wrong, for the other shoe to drop, for him to change his mind. He wouldn't. When they pulled into his driveway, she hesitated before getting out, her gaze sweeping over the house. Small, simple, quiet. No signs of a family inside. Victor led her in, flicking on the hallway light, stepping aside so she could take in the space at her own pace. The guest room was ready. It had been empty for years, untouched except for the occasional deep cleaning. He had added a fresh set of blankets earlier that day, but otherwise it was bare. A bed, a dresser, a small desk by the window. Nothing personal, nothing that felt like home. She stepped inside, eyes scanning the room like she was assessing every possible exit. Then, instead of moving toward the bed, she took the blanket and pillow and quietly spread them out on the floor. Victor stood in the doorway, something heavy pressing against his ribs. He didn't question it, didn't try to make her move. He just grabbed an extra pillow from the closet, walked over, and set it down beside her blanket. "Get some rest," he said softly. "This is your home now." She didn't answer, just lay down, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Victor turned off the light, leaving the door open a crack before heading to his own room. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Victor lay on his back staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house. The weight of it all settled deep. The past, the present, the choices that had led him here. His eyes drifted to the nightstand, to the framed photo that had sat there for years. Haley, his little girl, frozen in time, smiling up at him from a past that still felt too close some nights. Serge's eyes had that same guarded look Haley used to get when she was scared to ask for something, afraid of the answer. Victor exhaled, pressing a hand over his face. He had lost Haley, had lost everything that made life make sense. But Serge, maybe she wasn't his daughter. Maybe she never would be. But she was a kid who needed someone to stay. And this time, he wouldn't fail. Serge didn't trust comfort. She didn't trust quiet. And she sure as hell didn't trust kindness. Victor saw it in the way she moved, the way she carried herself, small, careful steps, like she was always ready to run. She never strayed far from her bag, kept it close like a shield, her fingers gripping the straps even when she was just sitting on the couch. She cleaned up after herself, with military precision, wiped down the kitchen counter after breakfast, folded the blanket on the sofa, even when she hadn't used it. She never asked for anything, never said if she was hungry, never complained. It took Victor exactly 2 days to realize that the girl had spent so much time expecting disappointment that she didn't even consider another option. And that made his chest ache in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. The first real crack in her walls came one morning when he left for work. He had written her a note, simple, just letting her know he'd be back in the afternoon, that there was food in the fridge, that she didn't have to do anything but rest. He thought it would be enough. But when he pulled into the driveway later that day, she was sitting on the front steps, her knees drawn to her chest, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. Victor barely had time to kill the engine before she was on her feet, standing stiff like she was trying not to shake. "You said you'd come back," she whispered. "I did." She swallowed hard. I thought..." She didn't finish. Didn't need to. Victor exhaled, stepping forward. He wasn't great with words, never had been, but he knew what this was, what she was feeling. He had seen it before in kids who had been left too many times to count, who had been promised love and safety only to have it yanked away without warning. He crouched down so they were at eye level. "I ain't going anywhere," he said. She stared at him, searching his face for something. Proof, maybe. A reason to believe. But trust wasn't built in a day. So he didn't push. He just stood up, opened the door, and waited. It took her a moment, but she followed. Things didn't get easier overnight. Victor tried to build small routines, breakfast together before he left for work, dinner at the table instead of in front of the TV. At night, he sat with her, reading from an old book about the constellations, even when she didn't respond, even when she just curled into herself and listened, without a word. She was still wary, still quiet. But she stopped flinching when he walked past her. She started leaving her bag in her room instead of carrying it everywhere like a lifeline. And then, one night, something shifted. Victor was halfway through a passage about Orion's belt when her voice cut through the quiet. "Do you think my mom and Haley are up there?" she asked. "Watching us?" Victor's breath caught in his throat. She had never spoken about her mother before, had never mentioned Haley's name, not once, not even when she saw the pictures on the wall. He swallowed, pushing past the tightness in his chest. "I think they're watching," he said, "and I think they're smiling." There was a long pause. Then, so soft, he almost didn't hear it. "Good night, Dad?" It was hesitant, almost a whisper, but it was there. Victor closed the book, set it aside, and reached out, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Good night, kid." But not everyone was kind. Victor knew what people could be like. He had seen the way Charleston looked at outsiders, at people who didn't fit into the neat, quiet lines of the town. And Saoirse? She was different, and not just because of where she came from. She was black. And Charleston had a long history of making sure people like her never forgot that. The first time it happened, Victor wasn't there. Saoirse had agreed, reluctantly, to go to the park just for a little while. He had driven her there, let her go on ahead while he finished a phone call. She was sitting alone on a swing when they approached. A group of local boys, maybe 10 or 11, the kind that ran in packs, the kind who had grown up in houses where certain words were still spoken behind closed doors. At first, they just stared. Then came the whispering, the looks. Then one of them, blonde-haired, all false confidence, called out, "Hey, ain't nobody told you? You don't belong here." Saoirse had heard worse. She had spent enough nights in the cold to know what people were capable of saying, what they were capable of doing, so she ignored them. But they weren't done. "What? You think just because you got a white man taking care of you, that makes you special?" The boy laughed. "Bet he'll throw you out soon enough. That's what they all do." She didn't look up, didn't move. She had learned a long time ago that silence was the safest response. But then something hit her. A rock, small but sharp, bouncing off the side of her shoe. She inhaled sharply, her fists clenching. And that was when she heard him. "What the hell is going on here?" Victor's voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. The boys froze. Saoirse had never seen Victor truly angry before, not like this. His jaw was tight, his stance solid, his eyes cold as he looked at them. One of the kids muttered something under his breath, something about just messing around. But Victor wasn't interested. "I ever see any of you near her again," he said, voice dangerously calm. "We're going to have a problem. Now, you hear me?" The boys scattered like leaves in the wind. Victor turned to Saoirse. She was still sitting on the swing, staring at the ground, shoulders rigid. He crouched beside her. "I don't care what they said," he told her. "They're wrong." She swallowed hard. Victor hesitated, then, without thinking, reached out, gently, carefully, until his hand rested over hers. "You belong, kid. Don't let them tell you otherwise." For a long moment she didn't move. Then slowly her fingers curled around his. And for the first time in a long time she believed him. Saoirse still had nightmares. Some nights they were soft, distant things, whispers of old fears that curled around her thoughts but didn't hold on too tight. Other nights they came like a flood, washing over her in waves of cold sweat and shallow breaths, dragging her back into the past before she could fight her way out. But something had changed. Now, when she woke, she wasn't alone. One night, long past midnight, Victor stirred awake to the faintest sound, the shuffle of small feet in the hall. He blinked, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and turned toward the door. She was there, standing just outside his room, her hands twisted in the hem of her shirt, her shoulders drawn in tight. Victor sat up, his voice low and even. "What's wrong, kid?" She hesitated, then whispered, "I don't want to sleep alone." Victor felt something in his chest pulled tight. She had never asked for anything before. Not food, not help, not comfort. She had learned a long time ago that asking meant risking disappointment. Without a word, he lifted the blanket, an unspoken invitation. Saoirse hesitated only a second longer before she crossed the room and climbed onto the bed. She curled up small, back turned toward him, quiet and still. Victor didn't move, didn't push. He just let her be. And for the first time since she had come to live with him, she slept through the night. Of course, things weren't easy. When Victor made the decision to adopt her officially, the pushback came fast. Social workers had questions. The system had rules. A single man in his 50s living alone, taking in a child who wasn't his by blood. People didn't like the things that didn't fit into neat little boxes. The first meeting at the agency was all polite smiles and careful words, but Victor could see what they weren't saying. The woman across from him adjusted her glasses, flipping through a stack of papers. "Adoption is a serious commitment, Officer Chavez. Are you sure this is the best decision for both of you?" Victor met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." She nodded, making a note on the file. "You have to understand. There are concerns. You're a single man, and Saoirse has already been through significant trauma. The transition won't be easy." Victor exhaled slowly, keeping his temper in check. He knew they had a job to do, but this wasn't just some bureaucratic case to him. This was a little girl who had spent too many nights alone, who had learned the hard way that people leave. "I know it won't be easy," he said, voice firm, "but she's already been alone long enough. I can give her a home." The social worker studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "All right. We'll start the process, but it won't happen overnight. There will be home visits, evaluations." Victor nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes." One Saturday afternoon, Victor took Saoirse to the hardware store. She needed a room that felt like hers, and that meant picking out paint. Her choice, not his. She stood in front of the giant wall of color swatches, her fingers hovering over the tiny squares of paper. For a long time, she didn't move, just scanning the rows. Then finally, she plucked one free, a soft golden yellow. Victor raised an eyebrow. "Yellow, huh?" She nodded. "It looks like the sun." Victor swallowed hard. She didn't say it, but he knew what she meant. It looked like warmth, like something she had never thought she could reach. He reached for another swatch, just a shade deeper. "How about this one? Still warm, but a little richer." She held them side by side, tilting her head before nodding. "Yeah, I like that." "All right," he said, tucking them into his pocket. "Yellow it is." That night, Victor was just settling into bed when he heard small footsteps outside his door. He waited. A second later, a shadow appeared in the doorway. Saoirse hesitated, then took a small step forward. "I forgot to say goodnight." Victor felt something shift in his chest. She had said it easily this time. No hesitation. No doubt. He smiled, holding out an arm. "Come here, kid." She crossed the room and let him pull her into a hug, small and warm against his chest. He pressed a hand gently to her back. "Good night, kiddo." She didn't say anything, just held on a little longer before pulling away. Victor watched as she walked down the hall, back to her room, her home. The day had finally come. Victor sat stiffly in the courthouse, his hands resting on his knees, fingers tapping a slow, steady rhythm against the fabric of his pants. Across from him, Saoirse sat just as still, her small hands folded in her lap, her back straight like she was bracing for something. She had been quiet all morning. Not scared exactly, but uncertain. Victor understood. After everything she had been through, after all the times she had learned not to expect too much, it was hard to believe in something as permanent as family. The courtroom wasn't crowded. Just a handful of people. The judge, the court clerk, a caseworker, and the lawyer handling the adoption. It should have been simple. A formality, really. But Victor had spent enough time in courtrooms to know that simple didn't always mean easy. The judge, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair, adjusted her glasses and looked down at the papers in front of her. "Mr. Chavez," she said, her voice even, "you understand that by adopting Saoirse, you assume full legal and parental responsibility for her?" Victor sat up straighter. "Yes, ma'am." The judge turned her gaze towards Saoirse, her expression softening just slightly. "And you, young lady, are you ready for this?" Saoirse hesitated, her fingers tightening around the hem of her dress. For a brief second, Victor worried. What if she wasn't ready? What if this was too much, too fast? But then she lifted her chin, her voice steady, but quiet. "I want to stay." The judge nodded, satisfied. A few more formalities, a signature, a stamp. And then, "It is my honor to grant this adoption. From this day forward, Saoirse will be legally recognized as the daughter of Victor Chavez." Just like that, it was done. Victor let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Beside him, Saoirse sat frozen, like she was waiting for something to go wrong, for someone to take it back. He reached for her hand, giving it a squeeze. She squeezed back. And then, without a word, she turned and buried her face into his side. Victor wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight. For the first time in a long, long time, she let herself believe. The courthouse steps were warm beneath their feet as they walked outside, the afternoon sun stretching long shadows across the pavement. Victor had expected Saoirse to want to go home, but instead she tugged at his sleeve, looking up at him with something unreadable in her eyes. "Can we go to the laundromat?" Victor blinked. Of all places, he hadn't expected that. "You sure?" She nodded. So he took her. The laundromat looked the same as it always had. Worn-down machines humming in rows, the air thick with the scent of detergent. It wasn't busy, just a couple of people folding clothes, lost in their own worlds. Saoirse walked to the back, to the bench where she used to sit night after night. She stood in front of it, silent for a long time, then slowly lowered herself onto the seat. Victor sat beside her. She ran her fingers along the edge of the bench, tracing the worn grooves in the plastic. "It doesn't feel the same," she murmured. Victor watched her carefully. "No?" She shook her head. "It's not scary anymore." A beat of silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, she exhaled and leaned into him, resting her head against his arm. Victor felt something inside him settle. For so long, they had both been searching for answers, for safety, for something to hold on to. And now, sitting here together, he realized they had found it. Each other. Saoirse let out a small breath, barely a whisper. "You saved me." Victor shook his head, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "No, kid," he murmured. "We saved each other." The journey of Victor and Saoirse is one of pain, healing, and the quiet power of human connection. From the moment Victor first saw the lonely girl at the laundromat, their fates were intertwined, not by blood, but by something even stronger, the need for belonging. Saoirse's transformation is especially moving. She begins as a child shaped by abandonment, distrustful, guarded, expecting nothing from the world. Yet, through Victor's steady presence, she slowly learns to believe in safety, warmth, and love. Her growth isn't sudden or dramatic. It's built through small, everyday moments, shared breakfasts, whispered goodnights, and the simple act of painting her room yellow, a color she never thought she could reach. Victor, too, finds healing. Haunted by loss, he wasn't searching for redemption, yet it found him in the form of a child who needed him as much as he needed her. Their bond isn't just about saving Saoirse, it's about saving each other. This story teaches us that family isn't just about blood. It's about choice, about showing up, about love in its quietest, strongest form. It reminds us that no one should have to face the world alone, and sometimes the most unexpected connections can lead to the most profound healing. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.